The conflict in Gaza has been called the deadliest in history for journalists. According to the Costs of War project, more journalists have been killed there than in both world wars, the US wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan combined. Some reports show that the number of journalists and media workers who have been killed since Israel's assault began in October 2023 is now about 270. A recent attack by Israel on a media tent outside a hospital in Gaza City killed 4 Al Jazeera journalists, including high-profile correspondent al-Sharif. He and his colleagues were remembered at a memorial service.
It was a deliberate assassination by the Israeli forces against our team in Gaza. We lost 2 of our bravest correspondents, al-Sharif, who covered this war since November, for Al Jazeera since November 2023, and Mohammed Iqriqa, who joined Al Jazeera after the killing and the assassination of our correspondent in Gaza, Ismail Al-Ghul, in July 2024.
Joining me now from Istanbul to discuss all of this is award-winning journalist Arwa Damon. She is a former CNN senior international correspondent who spent years covering conflict in the Middle East. She's also the founder and president of the Inara charity, an organization that provides aid to children in war-torn areas, including Gaza. Arwa, great to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as I mentioned, you are a former senior correspondent, international correspondent for CNN. You spent years covering the Middle East. You are familiar with war zones and the job of a war correspondent. Why have so many journalists been killed in Gaza? As I said, it's been called the deadliest war for journalists in history.
Because, simply put, there is no protection for journalists in Gaza, because the sort of bare minimum of respect for the rules of war that determine the media to be non-combatants and as such not a target are not actually being applied when it comes to Gaza. Look, on the one hand, Gaza is very densely populated. A lot of these, journalists, they do go back home. They could, in some cases, perhaps, one could argue, have just been, caught up in all of the bombings that were happening. That being said, the Committee to Protect Journalists has determined that in dozens of these killings, the journalists were in fact deliberately targeted. And if we look just at Anas al-Sharif's case, the Committee to Protect Journalists had already put out a warning saying that they were fearful for his life because of the threats that he had been receiving. He himself had been quite outspoken about the threats that he had been receiving, effectively being told to keep quiet, stop reporting, or else face the consequences. And we see this happening over and over and over again, not just in his case, but in the cases of so many others where they receive threats, and when they don't stop reporting, we do see them being targeted, especially Al Jazeera's journalists. I mean, that newsroom has lost so much when it comes to, their reporters, their teams, their staff in Gaza either being killed or injured, because they are the most powerful voice on the ground, and they are, the most capable organization on the ground that has its teams all over who are doing extraordinary work. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. If we just think about how long these journalists have been working non-stop, themselves also feeling the very same fears they're reporting on, going through the very same hunger, the very same struggles every single day. I mean, hats off to them, really.
You mentioned the Committee to Protect Journalists. This is what the organization's chief executive, Jody Ginsburg, had to say. Let's listen.
Journalists are civilians. They're considered civilians in a war setting, and as such, as civilians, they must never be deliberately targeted. It is clear that Israel knew that in that tent were not only an individual whom they accuse of being a terrorist, but 4 other journalists, at least 4 other journalists and media workers, whom it has said nothing about. It must have known that those individuals were journalists. It knew those individuals were journalists, and yet it targeted them anyway. That makes this a war crime.
So, Arwa, as we just heard there, Jody Ginsburg says that deliberately targeting journalists is a war crime. Israel has tried to justify this by saying that Anas al-Sharif was a terrorist. It has not provided any evidence for that. I mean, how chilling is this for journalists trying to do their job in Gaza?
It's horrifying. Look, I have been to Gaza 4 times, actually, with my charity on humanitarian missions. And, I've spent time with Gaza's journalists, and those who messaged me after this particular strike were very, very concerned about their own safety, which is completely understandable because journalists have no protection. And Israel, and it is quite clear, is able to act with complete and total impunity. And Israel uses this narrative of, but Hamas to justify just about anything. And again, if we specifically go back to the case of al-Sharif, look, they've been tracking him for months. They track their targets for months. That's how military tracking actually works. But his case in particular, they've been following him, they've been tracking him. It's a very deliberate choice to take that strike exactly at the moment when he's in a journalist tent surrounded by colleagues. And that's assuming that what Israel is alleging is true, but Israel has not provided any evidence. And Israel tends to not provide any evidence. And of course, it's hardly the first time, even well before October 7th, you have the case of, for example, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot in the neck in the West Bank, just for reporting, just for doing her job. And Israel initially tried to cover that up and blame it on some random gunman. And so this is a trend and a trajectory that is extraordinarily disturbing, not just when it comes to the safety and security of journalists who are either, in Gaza, in the West Bank. Let's not forget about our colleagues who are also very deliberately targeted in Lebanon. But it sends a very chilling message to those who are still on the ground trying to do their job, not to mention a horrifying precedent for what other countries might try to do in the future.
Israel has not allowed any international correspondents into Gaza. The coverage that we are seeing comes from those journalists, those Palestinian journalists that we are talking about, who are doing, as you point out, a heroic job there. Now, Israel's been accused of committing a genocide in Gaza, ethnic cleansing. It's also been accused of committing war crimes. Amnesty International says Israel isn't just assassinating journalists, but attacking journalism itself by preventing the documentation of a genocide. If international reporters are let in at some point, what will the global impact be?
I said this after the first time I set foot in Gaza, well over a year and a half ago right now. The war would end almost immediately. Because you do not set foot into Gaza and not realize within those first few minutes that the narrative that Israel has been trying to push forward is completely and totally false. And this is exactly why the press isn't being allowed into Gaza. And now I would actually take it a bit further than what Amnesty International is saying, because Israel isn't just trying to silence the voices of Palestinian journalists on the ground. It's actually also taking extra measures to silence the voices of others who are also in Gaza, who could potentially bring the stories of what they're witnessing to an international and broader audience, and that is the humanitarian community. You have these new rules and regulations that Israel wants all international organizations to abide by. And they're quite vague and opaque. And, there's a lot of issues with them, including wanting all of our staff lists and the names of our private donors. But what really jumped out to me in these new rules and regulations, because you don't need to read between the lines to understand what they intend, is this very vague language that basically says a denial can be issued based on rhetoric that is deemed to delegitimize Israel. And so they're very clearly also telling the humanitarian community to keep their mouths shut as well.
There have been some journalists who've criticized the killing of the Al Jazeera journalist. Here is one of them, Dana Moles from Plus 972 magazine.
I'm here to protest the intentional targeting and assassination of journalists in Gaza, which is unashamedly an attempt to conceal the truth from the rest of the world and from Israel. There are over 240 journalists killed thus far. This week we know of al-Sharif and his team from Al Jazeera.
There's been some criticism leveled at Israeli journalists as well, saying that they're not doing enough to tell us what is going on in Gaza. And there's also criticism against international media, like the BBC, for instance. Why do you believe this is the case? Why are some international media organizations not making a stronger case?
Fear. And quite frankly, I would also argue that the sort of self-reflection that should have taken place post 9/11, given just how wrong a lot of the Western media got the story and just how quickly they were to believe the US narrative, but they never really, went and actually did what is very difficult work, but a self-review of what went wrong. And we're seeing that happening once again, in this post-October 7th world that we're living in. There is an underlying bias when it comes to how the story of Arabs, but specifically in this case, Palestinians, is reported and presented. I find it utterly mind-boggling that the dehumanization of Palestinians has been so great that we need to constantly remind people when we're talking about our experiences in Gaza or when we're talking about the Palestinian population that they live, love, and laugh just like the rest of us. And the media and a lot of media organizations, granted there are extraordinary journalists within each organization, but broadly speaking, have had a very one-sided view of what's been happening and have also been very quick to believe the narrative that Israel wants to push forward and not really hold it under the microscope in a way that would actually be responsible had any other country but Israel actually been making same or similar statements. And there is a lot more that all media organizations can be doing. And actually the Columbia Journalism Review just put out an article that contains dozens of suggestions from, myself and other, journalists, activists, people who have different kinds of ideas as to what the international media and organizations can begin to do as a whole to try to put pressure on Israel to allow more journalists into Gaza. And the reason why more journalists need to go into Gaza isn't because Palestinian journalists are doing a bad job. It's because too many Western journalists have chosen, or organizations have chosen up until now, to continue to discredit and dismiss what Palestinian journalists, but also the humanitarian community, quite frankly, have been reporting.
I want to turn now to some of your own experiences in Gaza. You pointed out a moment ago that you've been to Gaza 4 times since October 7th. What have you seen, and does it come anywhere close to what we see on our television screens?
It doesn't. It doesn't, because there's only so much that you can capture in a camera, and the camera's kind of, you're looking straight ahead. But what you see when you're there is that it's all around you. And these moments that happen there, they're not really captured on camera necessarily. Our social media, screens, our TV screens are flooded with these horrific images. And that's one part of what's happening in Gaza. But the other part of what's happening in Gaza that I genuinely wish more people could see is how the population's humanity has continued to survive in these unimaginable circumstances. The small acts of kindness that you see, whether it's someone who invites you in for a cup of coffee, even if it's the last bit of coffee they have, or my own program coordinator, Yusra, who took a little boy who she met a birthday cake made of loaves of bread that she had to scrounge around to find because she just wanted to give him a little bit of joy that day. But people also don't see just how hard it is every single day. You don't see the way that the fatigue has just ebbed into everyone's bones and their soul and their psyche, and the way that their steps are actually getting heavier and slower as more and more of the mental toll coupled with the hunger really begin to set in. You don't see the constant images that you see when you're driving through the areas of Gaza that we're able to drive through, of children without shoes on, rummaging through garbage, or running after a vehicle hoping that they might be able to snag a bottle of water. You don't see the way that the exhausted mother cradling her baby kisses the top of its head. And so, I've been in a lot of war zones. I've been in just about every single war zone you could possibly think of over the last 20 years. And Gaza does not even come close to anything that I have seen. And I think one of the more sort of difficult things to grasp when it comes to Gaza is that, unlike other war zones, for example, the humanitarian community tends to be sort of one step away from the fighting because we're meant to be able to fully provide services, and generally speaking, we are able to provide those services. When it comes to Gaza, we are in it and we're not able to provide for the people because Israel keeps obstructing our ability to work.
You founded the organization in Nara, and you've been trying to provide aid, particularly to children in places like Gaza. How would you describe the impact on children, not just the numbers, but the emotional toll that it's having on children? I mean, you've talked with them. You've been able to look directly into their eyes, into their faces. How devastated are they?
I have never seen a child whose soul is as destroyed as the soul of Gaza's children are. But I say that, and that doesn't mean that we should just dismiss and forget about them, because that spark of life can be brought back. But there is something that is utterly horrifying when you watch a group of children who are looking at a performance being carried out by a clown, because yes, we are able to find the makeup and we are able to bring, clowns and acrobats and create these like brief little events for the kids in Gaza. But the kids aren't reacting the way that they're supposed to. They're not sort of laughing along. They're not engaging with what's around them. They're silent. And that's when you realize the depth of the trauma. Or when you talk to the parents who tell you that their child has gone completely nonverbal. Look, we have a couple of cases, because we also do work in Egypt with those that have been able to evacuate Gaza, of children that have gone completely nonverbal. They have stopped talking because they just don't know how to process. And the big challenge when it comes to children's mental health, or just mental health in general, is that the kind of work that anyone can do in a place like Gaza is actually very surface level, because the triggers and the traumas are still coming at the child every single day. And that's not even getting into the horrific scenes that you see in the hospitals of children suffering catastrophic injuries, but having to undergo amputations without proper anesthesia, or even just, the basic trauma on a child to look at their parent and be hit with that realization that mommy and daddy cannot protect you and cannot keep you safe. I remember when the ceasefire was broken, one of my team members told me that he was talking to a little boy, and the little boy said to him, "I don't trust myself anymore. And I don't trust myself anymore because when the ceasefire happened, I allowed myself to have hope, but now I know that that is a lie." And that is a big statement for a little 8-year-old to say.
Arwa Damon, we wish you the best with your organization. Hope you have lots of success there. Thanks so much for being with us. And now for more perspective, joining me is Dan Arbell. He's a veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service and currently scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Also with us is Khalil Jashan. He is Executive Director of the Arab Center right here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you. Dan, good to see you. We've just been watching and listening to that harrowing account of what's taking place in Gaza right now and the toll that it's taken on so many journalists who are working there in Gaza, all of them Palestinian. There are reports that up to 270 journalists have been killed. Amnesty International accuses Israel of deliberately assassinating journalists. What is Israel's response to these accusations?
First of all, Anand, good to be with you, and it's about time to end this war. I think war goals that Israel has placed in the beginning are advancing, and there's a need to get to an end of the war and get to the release of all Israeli hostages, and the sooner the better. As for the journalists, then what Israel is saying in light of the recent killing of the journalists at the al-Shifa hospital in Gaza is that Israel identifies them as Hamas operatives. Well, I'm not an Israeli government spokesman. I was not there on the ground. I don't know exactly how things developed, but the Israeli version of this, or the Israeli position, is that while they were journalists, on one hand, they were also Hamas operatives, and their journalistic cover allowed them to kind of do both roles, to fill both roles. So that's kind of where things are at. And as Israel is targeting Hamas operatives, it certainly targeted these individuals. That's all I can say at this point.
Khalil Jashan, what do you make of that Israeli justification for the assassination of Anas al-Sharif? He was killed in that media tent with some other colleagues as well. Israel said that he was what they termed a terrorist, a Hamas fighter. There is no evidence of that.
Precisely. I mean, if Israel had the evidence, rest assured, we would have heard it ad nauseum, not just through Israeli media, but through American media as well. But they do not have that evidence. Clearly, look, Israel has a long history of antagonism with the media, including its own media. I mean, Israel pretends to be a democracy, and it has many practices that could be classified as such, including voting and parties and what have you. But Israel also has one of the most strict system of censorship on the media that they have managed over the years to make itself censorship. And, again, the Israeli strategy here is if you don't like the message, kill the messenger. And the fact that there has been no accountability, as you mentioned, more than 270, that's more than World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, etc. Every war since then. We've never had such a high number of journalists. Imagine if foreign journalists were allowed in Gaza to cover this war, what the number would look like. This is just the local journalists. But again, these accusations, as I said, have never been proven. And even if there were such a basic element of truth to them, I've dealt with the Israeli media for 50 years, all right? More than 2/3 of the Israeli media are either Mossad or Shin Bet agents. So Israel has no basically right to even argue in those terms.
Dan, Khalil mentioned foreign correspondents there, and there is a question that we hear very often, and it's being posed with increasing frequency right now, and that is, why is Israel not allowing international journalists into Gaza?
So the official answer is that it doesn't, as Israel is responsible for their safety, it does not want to jeopardize that safety. It does not want to put them in harm's way, and the unofficial reason, however, I think has to do with coverage of what's happening on the ground, and I don't think that Israel has an interest at this point in allowing the media to freely parade in Gaza and the vicinity to report about what's going on.
Khalil, I want to turn now to the latest on what is taking place in Gaza. The official death toll is now more than 62,000 Palestinians killed since October 7th. The territory is devastated. We're now seeing people dying from starvation as well. But Israel has just announced a new offensive. In fact, it announced that it will be calling up 60,000 reservists ahead of what it calls a ground offensive. What is going to happen once this offensive gets underway?
All you have to do is read the warning of the security apparatus and the military apparatus in Israel. They objected politically to the political leadership about this whole campaign. They didn't think it was necessary. They didn't think it would lead to the intended results that Netanyahu claims, at least publicly. And they warned against extensive or additional, if you will, civilian casualties. When you think about entering the city itself, Gaza City, one of the most basically concentrated population in the world, including people who have found refuge by Israeli demand and by Israeli pressure, push the people in the north and the people in the south into these urban centers, and then they come in to basically comb, quote unquote, these areas by ethnically cleansing them. You are apt to see more than the average 3,000 civilian casualties a month, which has been the average since October 7, 2023. I think the numbers that you mentioned, 62, could easily jump over the next few weeks if the campaign unfolds fully, as Mr. Netanyahu is talking about it. We could see maybe 80 to 90,000 casualties instead of 62.
All right, Dan, as far as this offensive is concerned, I mean, we have heard that there are differences between the Israeli military leadership and the political leadership in Israel. Many commanders, including the chief of the military force, have made known their concern about this offensive. We've also heard very inflammatory statements from some Israeli ministers, from the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who says it may be moral to starve 2 million Palestinians. We also heard from a former intelligence chief who said that Israel should kill 50 people for every one of the victims on October 7th. What is Israel's goal here?
So I think that the main word here is if Israel does pursue this plan and what goes ahead, because Israel needs to present a credible military threat as a pressure tactic vis-a-vis Hamas. And so it is calling up reservists, and it is getting its forces ready and all that to place that pressure on Hamas, hoping, and I'm hoping too, that this would lead to Hamas agreeing to a deal and the release of hostages and to ceasefire and all that. And so, which will kind of not make it necessary to launch this attack on Gaza. But certainly there's a debate within Israel between the military echelon led by the chief of staff of the IDF, Eyal Zamir, who was quoted as saying that if IDF soldiers enter Gaza City, it's entering a death trap. And at the same time, the government of Netanyahu is pushing to do this, I think mostly for political reasons and not so much strategic reasons. And so right now, where the push and pull are taking place, and we'll see in the coming days whether this goes to a fight, a continued fighting, or perhaps a ceasefire deal.
Well, as you point out, Dan, as you said, there's push and pull taking place right now, but at the same time, there are other developments, and something else has happened is some of Israel's closest allies, countries like France, like Australia, are now talking about recognizing a Palestinian state. We could see that happen at the next General Assembly meeting at the United Nations next month. Prime Minister Netanyahu has lashed out at the French president and the Australian Prime Minister for their plan to recognize a Palestinian state. Is it going to make much of a difference, or does Israel risk undermining relations with close allies?
So I think, first of all, has a symbolic importance in terms of all these countries recognizing a state of Palestine, although that state of Palestine is still not in existence. At the same time, it certainly increases pressure on Israel internationally, and it's leading to further Israeli isolation in their international arena, and certainly not good for Israel. Netanyahu, all that he can do is blame everybody else and not look at himself. But at the end of the day, as Israel is becoming more and more isolated, we see expressions of that around the world, banning from sports events, whether it's Israeli tourists being chased in the streets of Spain or Greece, and so on and so forth. It's very, very unpleasant. Israelis are beginning to feel that that pressure. And so while, and it does, to your question, it does risk further deterioration of relations between Israel and allies and friends.
Okay, Dan Arbell, Khalil Jashan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Knight in Washington.